Hi, welcome back. This is the failure of compromise, lesson 5.6. This is the decade of crisis from 1850 to 1860 and some of the events that led up to the Civil War. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the political causes of the Civil War. So this is straight up causation. What caused the Civil War politically? As you can see from looking at this slide, there are two main political actions. The courts and national leaders made decisions, and they did attempt to resolve the issue of slavery in the territories. These two attempts at compromise were the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. But as you will find out, neither one created a true compromise. They both ultimately failed to reduce the upcoming impending conflict. So let's start off with A, the crisis in Kansas. Stephen Douglas, a senator from the state of Illinois, a Democratic senator, was attempting to build a transcontinental railroad from Chicago all the way to California. And he was not getting the support of Southern Democrats. And he knew he needed politically to do something. He needed the funding in Congress. And he was able to persuade a few Southern Democrats to agree to funding the Transcontinental Railroad if some sort of resolution could be created that might allow the possibility of slavery in some of the former Louisiana territory. They came up with what is known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It is a bold term. As you can see, it is one you need to know now and forever. The act, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, opened up the territories of both Kansas and Nebraska to the principle of popular sovereignty. Sovereignty and this idea of popular sovereignty is giving the voters who are living in the territory the ability to decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. This is going against the previous Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise said anything north of the southern border of Missouri is not going to be allowed to have slavery. Kansas and Nebraska are both north of that border, so this does erase that. So, needless to say, the bill is opposed by the Northern Whigs, and it is opposed by this new political party called the Free Soilers because it would potentially open up this area to slavery, and this area had been closed since that Missouri Compromise of 1820. So for some 30-some years, the area had been closed off. So what happens is the law is passed with Democratic support and the Southern Whigs, who are called Cotton Whigs. The Southern Whigs provide their support. And this becomes the very first territory to be open to the idea of popular sovereignty. Kansas is that very first one. But as you can see, it is a recipe for disaster. It proves to be a miserable failure because what happens is an event known as Bleeding Kansas. It's called Bleeding Kansas, but quite literally, there is violence and bloodshed in Kansas. To start, a very prominent minister from New England. His name is Henry Ward Beecher. He and other New England churches gathered together and raised money to send radical abolitionists from New England to move to Kansas, just in order to sway the vote against the extension of slavery. Not to be outdone, the pro-slavery supporters in Missouri, remember, Missouri borders Kansas. They crossed over the border. Therefore, they are called border ruffians, and they are pro-slavery advocates, and they crossed over into Kansas for the sole reason of voting illegally in order to sway the election. So as you can see, both sides are staking their claim to Kansas. What happens next is violence and bloodshed. Let's rewind. If you remember from a previous lesson, a radical abolitionist, John Brown, a man who believed that he was on a divine mission from God, carried out his brutal attack on pro-slavery families in Kansas. That was part of the bleeding of Kansas. So there was violence and bloodshed from both sides. An entire city body was burned to the ground. This bloodshed also extends into the very hallowed halls of Congress itself in an event known as Bleeding Sumner. Charles Sumner actually does bleed. What happens is that on the floor of the Senate, while he is giving speech against slavery, because Sumner was from Massachusetts, a congressman from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, walks over to him and begins pummeling him with his cane, leaving him in a bloody mess on the Senate floor. This event is known as Bleeding Sumner. So as you can see, they began to divide even in Congress, not by party affiliation, but by the very idea of pro and anti-slavery forces. Sumner does get reelected, even though he is not able to return for several years because he's convalescing at home. What happens eventually? In the end, it is a mess. Kansas submits a pro-slavery constitution to Congress, but it is an illegal constitution, so it is rejected by Congress. Then later there is a second constitution written, and that one is the one that is approved. So when it's all said and done, Kansas does come into the United States of America as a free state. The next decision is a decision of the Supreme Court, quite arguably one of the worst decisions because it does not do what it is intended to do. Congress is paralyzed between the northern supporters of abolition and the southern supporters of slavery. President at the time is a northerner named James Buchanan. He is sympathetic to the South. He refuses to weigh in on the issue. He simply will not deal with it. He is pushing it on and hoping that the Supreme Court will settle the question once and for all. He wants a remedy. He seeks a solution. The court does agree to hear the case of Dred and Harriet Scott, two slaves from St. Louis, Missouri. They are suing for their freedom on the grounds that they had been living in Illinois, which is a free state, for several years. Thus, returning to Missouri, they sued and argued that they could not have been held as slaves. So therefore, it goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is a Southerner named Roger Taney. Most of the justices were Southern Democrats. So they were, of course, very, very biased. In the Dred Scott decision, the court makes a number of controversial and fateful decisions. Number one, Black citizenship. The court rules that Black Americans, whether they are slave or free, were not ever citizens, now, not ever, of the United States. And if you are not a citizen, you do not hold the rights and privileges of citizens. So you lack legal rights, such as voting, sitting on juries, and filing lawsuits. The Dred Scott decision also completely nulls and voids the Missouri Compromise, stating that you can take your slaves anywhere that you want to. Therefore, they never could have passed a law like that to begin with. So the impact of the Dred Scott decision, it does not settle the issue of slavery. In fact, it only fans the flames of greater discontent. In fact, it is the idea of popular sovereignty and expansion of slavery into the territories that Democratic Senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, and his Republican contender for the Senate seat, Abraham Lincoln, debate about. This is a series of debates in 1858 that are throughout the state of Illinois. They go down in history as the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Douglas advocates for popular sovereignty. It's the only remaining option to keep our nation together. Lincoln argues that only free soil is acceptable. In the end, the debates were a draw. Douglas is elected. However, it pulls Abraham Lincoln and his views about free soil out of obscurity, and it places him squarely as a figure of public interest. And that in turn leads to our next key concept. This is the decline of the second party system and the rise of sectional parties, regional parties, most notably the Republican Party. Let's talk about the decline of the Whigs. If you remember, the second party system was the Democrats, founded by Jackson, and the Whigs, founded by Henry Clay. What begins to happen is that the Whigs begin to divide along sectional lines. There are Northern Whigs who are abolitionists. There are Northern Whigs who are morally opposed to slavery in the territories. Southern Whigs, Cotton Whigs, support the expansion of slavery. So the Whig Party begins to divide along sectional lines, regional lines. Other new parties emerge. The two most notable are the Nativist Party, which is called the Know Nothing Party. They are nativist. This party's really not in the South, as there's not a lot of immigrants in the South. The immigrants were predominantly in the Midwest and northern big cities. The second new party is the Free Soil Party, which advocates for free soil to protect the West against the expansion of slavery for the sole purpose of keeping it for free white men. These two parties draw many of the Northern Whigs away from the Whig Party. So as you can see, the Whigs begin to disintegrate. Many Northern Whigs become free soilers. Many Northern Whigs become know-nothings. And it so happens that the Republican Party is also forming during this time. The origins of the Republican Party, as Kansas is bleeding and on fire, a new political party emerges. This is the Republican Party. Their platform appeals to Northern voters. Their platform is simple: free soil in the territories, and they are nativist and anti-Catholic. So they appeal to a broad spectrum of Northerners. The Republicans also promise not to touch slavery where it currently exists. However, it becomes a regional party because the Southerners simply don't trust that the Republicans will leave slavery alone. In contrast to the Democratic Party, the Democratic Party was a national party. The Republican Party was a regional party. It was only in the North. There were no Republicans in the South, period. The Democrats had Northern Democrats, such as Stephen Douglas, and they had Southern Democrats. But what you also start to see is that the Democratic Party also begins to splinter with internal divisions between the North and the South. So it is in this political climate that a man who hadn't really been popular, or nobody had even heard of him prior to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, emerges. He is Abraham Lincoln, and the Republican Party will soon begin to rally around him as their spokesperson because they feel he is the best candidate for success in the upcoming election of 1860. Our next lesson will be on the election of 1860 and secession of the South. So I hope by now you are able to explain the political causes, how the Kansas-Nebraska Act, how the Dred Scott decision, and how the decline of the second party system and the rise of the Republican Party leads to the Civil War in 1861. That's it for lesson 5.6.